The History of Work is a documentary currently in production that talks broadly about the history of work in this country in general. And there are so many rabbit holes to go down when we are peeling back that onion. Today we are going to get industry specific in our history lesson, which I'm so excited about because there's so much to the history of work that I won't be able to fit in just one documentary. I'm so thrilled to have today's guest on who will be talking about the racist and sexist history of caregiving. And I see that you're here. Hello, Josie.
I know, Wendy.
More on that later. So I'm going to introduce Josie here. She was born in Malawi. She has seen inequities in one of the poorest countries in the world and in one of the richest. As a former social worker, she saw firsthand the systemic challenges families experienced. She has since worked in policy advocacy, organizing, campaign and strategy development, and strategic planning for 2 decades, centering those most marginalized. And as a policy and movement expert, Josie is committed to transforming systems, policies, organizations, and dismantling racism and toxic culture norms and narratives of individualism, scarcity, and the deserving, all things that we need desperately. She holds a bachelor's in sociology and political science and a master's in social justice and community development. Code. She knows her shit, y'all. She currently serves as the executive director of family values at work. Ladies, gentlemen, and those beyond the binary, I give you Josephine Kalipeni. Thank you for joining us today.
That's the best sounding introduction I've ever gotten. You should record it. I'm going to keep it. I'm going to play it ahead of all of my appearances. That was so good.
Thank you so much for joining us today for this important conversation. And historically, the U.S. has depended on the free caregiving of enslaved Black women. The impacts of this, which can be felt in our healthcare industry today. So we're going to dive right into the first question. Give us a brief history of how the U.S. depended on free caregiving of enslaved Black women and how that kind of evolved over time.
It's a good place to start there. I mean, first we should say, like, the idea of work and caregiving and labor, it goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. Most of us in our faith subscriptions have stories. I'm a Christian. There's stories in the Bible around care and work. We know that, nobody discovered America. There were Native Americans here who were working and caring for their families and their communities. So it's not a new concept. It's the idea of colonization that restructured it in a very different way and in the way that we know it today. So we know that explorers came to America and confiscated and stole land from Native Americans. And in that, right, like we're talking about Britain and France, right, whose own environment of care and work is sexist and racist. So those colonizers brought those concepts here in their exploration of new land. And in that, they brought enslaved people from their own countries and engaged in the slave trade that were bringing slaves from Africa into the United States. All of this created an environment, right? Like, there was already the established belief from colonizers and the structure where women could stay home and take care of their homes and take care of their children and take care of their families while the men, the colonizers, were exploring land and establishing businesses and infrastructures and trade centers while women stayed home. the importing of enslaved Black labor meant additional support for white women who were doing the care work in their homes, right? So they, colonizers brought enslaved Black people into this country and put them to work. Most Black men were put into work in more arduous work in the fields, while many women were put inside homes, and let's be clear, most of those homes were plantations, where Black women, enslaved Black women, were running entire households, from the kitchen to childcare to the care of elders that were in the home. And we should also know that the concept of front of the house and back of the house is also slave terms that were meant to recognize where enslaved laborers were working, where they're working at the front of the house, where they're working at the back of the house doing laundry and cooking, or were they in the field, right? So we have those terms that still live with us today. And so that the concept of labor, enslaved labor and caregiving started back then, right? Where enslaved Black people were told that the way to work towards their freedom, or that their pay, was dilapidated housing, and that sort of started this exchange for either free or enslaved work, or exchanged work, where it was sort of set up as if your freedom was tied to the labor that you were giving, when we all can look back now and recognize it as free and uncompensated labor. So that's where the workforce of care started. And it's also where we have to recognize the truth that without that labor, without that workforce, white colonizers were not able to leave the house and set up the capitalistic infrastructure that we know today. So when we hear people say that this country was built off of the labor of enslaved Black women, enslaved Black men, that's what we mean, that the work of colonizers that has established the current economy and infrastructure that we know now would not have been possible without the labor support, the uncompensated, the enslaved, the arduous, the harassed, the challenging labor of Black folks that were enslaved. Wendy.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. It's a lot. So how does the historical role of Black women, specifically in caregiving, show up in
So
today?
Going back to that history, we have to remember that the traditional colonizers of this country already believed that a woman's place was in the home, caregiving for their children, and taking care of the house. So when those colonizers came to this country with their families, then the labor of Black women was also assigned, according to their existing thinking, the labor of women, right? And now the labor of Black women was assigned to supporting the women of the household. And so that history started with the colonizers' own history, but then was reinforced by bringing Black female laborers and slave laborers into conditions of caregiving. So now you have enslaved Black women who are coming into the home, whose bosses were the white women of the household, and they were given traditional care roles, which included caring for children, caring for aging adults that were in the home, caring for the woman that was head of the household, and doing things like cooking and cleaning and all of the domestic labor that we know today. That infrastructure of labor, right, like that set up a specific infrastructure, a belief about who does caregiving work, who does domestic work. It was already the belief that women do it. And so now you've added this extra layer that Black women do it, Indigenous women do it, Native American, enslaved, captured Native American women do it. And so that established sort of a belief system that caregiving is the work of Black women. And then when you add that Black women were enslaved and therefore not paid, when you start negotiating for what pay should be, when you're starting from decades of unpaid labor, you're not going to start very high, which is why it has been a continued theme in care that not only are women of color primarily caregivers, paid or unpaid, but that then the wages of those care workers has been depressed because it started as free labor. So when you're negotiating labor and compensation of work within a capitalistic infrastructure that's built on racism and sexism and colonization, you're not going to compensate that labor fairly or even nearly as equitably as you would the labor that is assigned to men, let alone the labor that is assigned to white men. So if part of capitalism is about maintaining a status quo, the idea of elevating labor of women of color, specifically our conversation around caregiving labor, the idea of elevating that value, right, of that labor at the same level as the value of labor being done by white men is not a status quo you're going to want to agitate. And so it continues the perception in the infrastructure that maintains a level of depressed wages, depressed work environments, and continues to shovel women of color into domestic work and into caregiving work that's uncompensated or undercompensated.
I love that you made that connection of when you're starting from nothing and then you have to negotiate up from there. It explains so much about the pay disparities that exist in our in our workplaces of all industries today. Why do you think understanding this history is so important? And then a part two to that is, why do you think people are trying to put legislative blocks to us understanding this history?
Wendy, that was...
I feel like it's the same answer, right?
Masterfully asked, though. That was really good. Okay, so here's what I've been thinking about lately when I think about all of this. You know, when we all seek medical care and when we're establishing new medical care, we're asked about our medical history. And we're asked about all of it, as much as we know. And many of us go into the work of asking family members about the details so we can give as comprehensive a history as possible. And we don't just say the good stuff, right? We don't just say all of the positive medical history, but we are asked about the negative medical history. Why? Because it impacts our medical team's ability in treating us now and in preventing bad things for the future. And so when I think about why it is important to understand this particular history, listen, we can have a conversation all day about racism and sexism and about whether or not people believe racism and sexism still exist. But the reality is we have to acknowledge the history, the good and the bad, if we are going to set up an economy that works, an economy now that works for everyone, and an economy that works in the future for everyone. We have to be able to recognize the bad things so that we can preventively solve for them and keep the bad things from happening now, right? So that understanding is really, really important. But also, you know, in all of our work, for many of us, we get regular evaluations that look back and identify where we've done things well and where we've done things not so well that need improvement. And this is one of those areas that we absolutely have to look back and do an evaluation. And lastly, when I think about how women are some of the fastest growing population of entrepreneurs, women are in some of the fastest growing care industries. Most of them are care industries. Most of them are the industries that make all other work possible. But women are some of the fastest populations of workers, right, in this country. And if we're going to change, right, the economic trajectory of individuals and of families and of communities, we can't keep shoveling women into low-paying jobs that are not family-sustaining jobs, that are not economy-sustaining jobs, and that are barely community-sustaining jobs. And so if we don't look at the history critically, we're going to repeat the same things, or we're going to maintain a status quo that we either don't intend to maintain, or that some actually intend for us to maintain through our ignorance. Yeah.
That analogy you gave of the medical history is fucking genius. Okay, I'm going to be using that in future debates. Pardon my French there. I couldn't help it. I'd never heard it so eloquently explained, and like, you can't argue with that. You can't argue with that. So what do you think needs to happen for things to change from here forward? Besides understanding our history, which is definitely important.
Yeah.
What else?
Okay, so we got to understand our history. We know that, right? Then there are the things that we absolutely have to do. For example, there are entire workforces that have been left out of labor rights and worker rights, right? Particularly domestic workers and care workers, who, because of the assumption that the work is being done by mostly Black people, mostly Black women, were left out of labor rights. We have to fix some of these exemptions, right, that have left out a ton of our working folks and a lot of working women. So that's legislative fixes, right? Like, we have to go back and fix places where entire workforces and entire workers were left out. This country has a history of that. We fixed the Constitution when it left out women's right to vote. So we can go back and fix where women were left out of workers' rights. In addition to that, we just have to establish better legislation and standards for workers. The fact that our current federal minimum wage is not a living wage, let alone a family-sustaining wage, is a policy choice. And it's a policy choice that impacts women of color specifically, but it has residual impacts onto our families, our communities, our economy, and generations to come. So we have to fix the wage. We have to fix wages in this country. Wages aren't increasing at the rate that the cost of milk is increasing. Hello, somebody in the audience. So wages have to rise at the same level as the cost of living so that people can keep up, so that our families can keep up. We also just have to fix the way we think about work, right? Wendy, you and I have talked about this. We expect people to work like they have no families and to take care of their families like they don't have to work. And the reality is that's inequitable. It negatively impacts workers, it negatively impacts women especially, and it negatively impacts our economy and the ability to set up workplaces that are productive and thriving. So we have to really annihilate this idea that people should work like they don't have families, and people should show up for families in these magical ways like they don't have to do work. So we have to make workplaces work, and that means having equitable benefits, and benefits like paid family and medical leave, benefits like paid sick days, benefits like affordable health care and affordable child care. And all of these are policy choices, and we can demand different choices and different outcomes. So we have to fix that. And then two other things that I'll mention, well, maybe three. So we also have to vote better, right? Like, the reality is we've become a country that's so politicized, so polarized. It's almost tribalistic in a way that makes me think about, countries that aren't America. Like, regardless of your party's subscription, like, folks should really be voting in the best interest of themselves, right? So, like, we have to vote different. We have to have access to an equitable and functioning democracy, and put different people in offices that actually represent not a party, but our values and the things that are our pressure points with real solutions. And then, Wendy, I think we, as a country, as individuals, I don't remove myself from this responsibility, but we have a lot of unlearning to do, right? Like, we are still having conversations about if someone calls off work, we start to question whether or not they're committed to work or whether or not they're productive workers. And we just have a lot of unlearning to do around our own genderized understandings, our own cultural understandings. The more we do the work to unlearn, the more we can actually do the work of advocating for and demanding systems that just work completely different.
Unlearning, man. I'm gonna watch this back and like be like, yeah. I'm gonna be taking notes. I feel like unlearning is a big one, because once you start unraveling that, it's hard to not see how everything is so interconnected, and to get kind of like a bigger picture of how all these issues are systemic and related to each other when they've been marketed to us as being separate.
I mean,
and
that's such a big thing.
compartmentalized.
And because of the unlearning we have to do, like some of these ideas, they're like marketed to us like they're like big and bold ideas, but it's because of the unlearning we have to do, where we have to say, actually, that's not a big and bold idea. That's actually just a right that every woman should have, that every caregiver should have, every worker should have. So we have a lot of we have a lot of unlearning to do. We have, and some of that really it impacts care and caregiving, because we have ideas about what a caregiver looks like, right? And we have these notions that men who are caregivers are weak, right? Or like, and so it's just like we have all of this unlearning to do, that will really mean a different kind of world, for ourselves. I even think about the idea that actually, like, my long-term goal in this work is not just about workplaces that work for workers, but it's actually about divorcing benefits from work altogether, right? And we say that, and it sounds so crazy, but the reality, when you think about that, someone's healthcare is connected to whether or not they're working, somebody's quality healthcare is connected to whether or not they're working, is crazy. And so, there's just this unlearning that we have to do, that for me to get to a point in my life where I have earned retirement means I should have worked for 60 plus years. Like, that's unlearning we have to do.
Yeah, and I feel like we talked a little bit about this before, that has been so normalized for us, that that compounded with the fact that we're, as a population, I feel like not good at critical thinking. And it's so normalized that when we do start to do this unlearning, we're like, wait a minute.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Wait a minute. So that's a big one.
Part of examining this history also, like we can look back to where it started, but there's also just been these moments in history that continue to reinforce care roles and gender roles in a way that is detrimental to women, but also requires our unlearning. So when we think about the idea that there was a point in time where women could not go to the front lines of war, right? So that meant all the men were going to war and women were left with caregiving responsibilities. And that when it came time for medical care and nursing care, all the men were being called to war. So who was left to play those roles, right? So there are these instances in history, right, that reinforce all of the, propaganda that's been given to us, all of the history that's been given to us, in a way where you get to a point where you don't even see it happening. So our attentiveness is really required of us.
Yeah, it becomes invisible. So what kinds of things do you have as like goals for the future? And you can speak generally or specifically to care roles and care work.
The reality about care work, about caregiving and care, is that it's not going away, right? Like, we are always going to be interdependent in a way where care and caregiving is always going to be part of the fabric, it's part of the fabric of our lives, part of the stories we all tell. So it's not going away. Like, care and caregiving is not going away. And if you're not in a situation where you need care, you are right around the corner from being in a situation where you're going to be called on to provide care. And, what I really hope for is a world and an environment where the demands of caregiving, right, where the requirement of caregiving, and as much as we can put it off and delay it, there will come an instance where we will not be able to say no anymore, right, when a caregiving demand has escalated to that level. And so my hope is to have an environment, an economy, a world where caregiving demands do not mean complete life disruption and complete destabilization. I think about all of the moments and all of the stories that I hear from men and women where caregiving disrupted their careers. They had to shift. They had to leave a job, turn down a promotion, where caregiving meant that they missed a student loan payment, missed a rent payment, and it completely destabilized their lives. There's an economic report that was released a couple of years ago by Pew Research that said that most middle-class families can't afford a $300 expense. When I think about the fact that many of us don't live close to the people that we love, that's an air ticket. If my mom calls me today and needs me, that's a flight to get to her. So if many of us can't afford a flight to get to the people who need us in their moment of need, or to be there in really important moments, without that destabilizing our lives completely, like I want us to get to, my hope is for us to get to a point in the care and caregiving trajectory of this country where the demands for caregiving don't destabilize ourselves and our families. That's my hope. That's my dream. And ultimately, I want a world, and I want us in this country, but especially Black women, to be able to work and live and rest and just be on our own terms. However individual Black women define that for themselves, however we define that for ourselves communally, like I want us to be able to live and be and thrive on our own terms. That's my hope. That's what I'm working for.
And what gives you hope for
that future? I have so many different pockets of hope. I know sometimes it's really, I have those days where I'm just like, why are we doing this? It feels like you're sort of hitting your head against a wall. And I have hope in so many small moments of reflection. Like I think about the Berlin Wall that fell decades back. And I remember that like my first images of that were like of individuals with small picks that were sort of like picking away at this wall, right? And it was such small sort of vignettes of different people doing their part until that whole wall fell, right? And so I have like moments of reflection of that, about it feels like the work that we're doing now feels so small, but it's contributing, right, like to this bigger moment, this bigger movement. So I find hope in that. At Family Values at Work, we are in 27 states with different state partners who are doing incredible grassroots work to impact change all across this country. So I find hope in talking to leaders in Nevada, with Make It Work Nevada, with Women Employed in Illinois, with Maine Women's Lobby in Maine, these sort of pockets of activity and activism and hope and work and community organizing at every level, at the city level, local level, state level, and at the federal level, of people who are like doing this work day in, day out, and trying to change the infrastructure of their own organization so that they can be better models in their community, and then modeling that within their community and convening and gathering groups of people who want to see things differently, and then letting that lead to legislative change and political change. And, so I'm finding hope, so much hope in our network, in small things. Like, we have leaders who reach out to us and say, we want to move to a 4-day work week because we don't think that the way work is structured right now actually means more productivity. And so, like, that feels small, big, right? Like, because it's such an internalized thing, but it's a model we can work from. To partners who are like, we want to increase wages for everyone in our state to a living wage and a family sustaining wage, and to tie wage increases to public benefits. And so that, and so, like, there are these, like, big and courageous things that give me hope. And then there are these, like, other small things that give me hope too, because I know it will take all of that. And then, Wendy, I would be remiss if I didn't say that I am a big supporter of, like, we have to keep having these conversations, right? Like, me and you talking today is like, this gives me hope. The fact that two people can sit down and still have a civil conversation and agree on some things and see things differently in something, and all of that lead to an exchange of ideas and an exchange of hope. Like, that also, like, these ongoing conversations, and the fact that our communities, we can't write people off. We just can't. It doesn't matter their political subscription, how absurd I might personally think their background is. We, like, this idea that we sort of adopted over the last few years, that there are entire groups of people we just write off and don't talk to, don't talk with, don't hear from, don't ask where they're coming from to seek a level of understanding and commonality. Like, these conversations have to continue, so they give me hope. And lastly, I just want to shout out my sister, just had a baby. So I have my first niece. Michaela is 6 weeks old, 7 weeks old. She turns 2 months next week. And I look at my sister and her husband as parents. I look at the ways that they're trying to establish a different home environment, that they have learned from their own history and are trying to offer my niece a different narrative about who she is, who she can be, the kind of world she can live in. And so I just have a lot of hope for the generations that are coming up behind us, and that they are seeing things and observing things and agitating, and they're getting into activism so much earlier. But that even from our own learnings, that we're telling a different story to the generations that are coming up behind us about what's possible. And so that, that gives me hope too.
Well, first I want to say congratulations, Auntie Josie. And I also want to say I love the visual, because I'm a very visual person, and the memory. And as you were describing it, I was getting chills of the Berlin Wall, and how people were there with just their little chisels.
Yes.
But together, the people with their little chisels, because I'm sure you have them. I have them too. We all have them. The days where, like, does this even matter? Does what I'm doing even matter? Because it seems so small. And now I'm going to think of that visual. And so that's going to give me a little bit of hope. And I love how you tied that into what Family Values at Work is doing. You've got these, for all intents and purposes, little chisels in the 27 states doing the work. So that you've given me some hope today. So I love that. So where can people find Family Values at Work? Obviously, you're here on Instagram at Family Values at Work. Where else can they find you?
So this is an invitation to everyone, right? Everyone that's working, everyone that knows someone who's working, everyone that's dealing with care and caregiving to join us in this movement to lend your voice, lend your time, be an activist, because every small bit counts. Your voice matters. You can do the Google thing and Google Family Values at Work. It will take you to our website where you can find all the ways to get involved. We have state partners we can connect you to. We have federal actions that we need everybody involved in. And through our website, you can not only join our email list, but you can also find where we are on Twitter and on Instagram and on this thing called TikTok that I'm still learning. Shout out to our digital team. But it's, again, like all of those platforms allow us to have the conversations that we need to have to get to the world that we want to have. So you can find us there, tweet at us, and, if you have a story to share, if you have conversations you want to have with us, we are all game and all willing to hear.
Thank you so much, Josie, Executive Director at Family Values at Work. I've learned some things here today, and I'm definitely going to go watch the replay again with my note-taking. And, as you were talking, I was trying, I can't heart my own live, but I was wanting to. I just want you to know that. For those of y'all who joined live, thank you. Those of you who are watching the replay, thank you. If you want to learn more about the history of work, you can go to the link in the bio and watch the trailer there. It's amazing, if I do say so myself. And would love to have more conversations here about, all of these histories that I can't get into the documentary, and are also important and show up in our workplaces today, and how we can learn from them and move forward. Josie, thanks again. This was fun and amazing and informative. Thanks for joining, y'all.
Thanks,
We'll see you next
Bye, everybody.
time. Bye.